I want to start by telling you a little briefly about what we do at Women for Women International and what I do in particular at Women for Women International. But before I start that, I bought some pictures because I wanted to actually, not only talk to you about the work that we do, I wanted to actually show you the images of hope, because we've heard a lot this week about the atrocity that's being committed by state actors. But I want you to take for a moment, briefly, those of you who are men, women in this audience. You may have children, you are fathers, you are mothers, you are sisters. I want you to imagine being a woman and being a prison. Not in a state prison, but your own home is a prison because of your gender. I want you to imagine briefly for a second that all the freedom that you enjoy today, that in a different place, and many of you who are here today have experienced that in a different place, in a different environment, your sole status as a woman means that you do not have the right to be here today. And as a man who are here today, you have the power to either give access or deny access to the women of your lives. And I want you to think about what it is that you would do being in that position. Globally, there are some 40 million plus women who are affected by rape and violence. Globally, there are 40,000 plus refugees in the world, and the majority of those are women and children. Over 40 million people across the world. In places like South Sudan, Sudan itself, DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, right now in Somalia, for example. And these are not just political refugees, but these are refugees who've been denied the rights to exist as human beings. Just imagine you are one of those refugees, and many of you have been affected by violence in many forms, but imagine those violence are in your very own home. At Women for Women International, we work in about 8 countries around the world. And we do primarily help women in contexts of conflict and war zone to rebuild their lives after conflict and very often during conflict. We work in some 8 countries around the world, in Iraq, Afghanistan, Bosnia, Kosovo, Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, Nigeria, and Rwanda. And each of these countries have their own unique challenges. But across the board, the consistent challenges that each of these women face is the fact that they are denying the very basic human rights that they are so deemed that is their own right. We've heard a lot about, mandates. We've heard a lot about things like the constitutions and, Beijing 5 and all of these global documents that are supposed to ensure every human being the right to exist as a decent human being. And the sad part about all of these great constitutions and all of these great documents is that in the majority part of the world, people are denied the rights to live a decent life. They are denied the right to education. They are denied the right to go to school. They are denied the right to exist as a human being. As we sit right now, somewhere in the world, a woman is being raped. Every minute, somewhere in the world, a woman is being raped. Imagine, for the time that we've been here, how many women have been raped. If they are not being raped in the form of their own body being violated, they are being negotiated. We've heard a lot about the peace process as it's going through. What is the one thing that is often negotiated? And we talk about this in the context of South Sudan or DRC, but globally, historically, rape and women being negotiated at the altar of peace negotiation have been a consistent theme across the world. Rape as a weapon of war has been consistently used. Now, we may want to ask ourselves, to what extent are these things possible? They are possible for a number of reasons. And the number one we can think of is that it is so acceptable, the disrespect for women. When a woman is violated, we, across the world, whether we're talking about this society or the context of South Sudan, you would imagine, in the context of conflict, over 80% of rape victims do not report it being raped. And the reasons are many. No one will listen. There are other priorities other than being raped. They have to go on about living and find safety. What you would not also imagine, even in the context like in many universities, say in America, over 80% of rape victims in university campuses do not report being raped. The reasons are consistently the same. The shame that is associated with being raped, in no context, when someone is raped, when a woman is raped, does she report being raped. But in the context where there are support mechanisms, women don't report being raped. Imagine in the context where there are no support mechanism or where there are no priorities. Rape and the disrespect for women is so common and pervasive because we normalize it. We negotiate it. We say, yes, women's issues are important, but really after, when we have peace, we will look at women's issues. When things are settled, we will look at women's issues. But what societies are beginning to recognize, and as leaders globally are beginning to recognize, and no society can deem healthy and normal if the majority of its population are being denied the right to exist and contribute to the well-being of the society. At Women for Men, we have one simple rule and policy. We believe that a society's well-being is determined by the well-being of the women in that society. And for all the talk we've had over the past 2 days, if you look at very closely of all the human rights violations, and when the human rights violation starts in any context, it's often the women who are raped, but very often we don't look at it because it's just one casual, bystander. It's just, oh well. But the truth of the matter is, in any context where there's been violence, the violence always starts with women. And so to the extent that our own safety, men, those with power and access to resources, whoever we are, to the extent that our well-being can be ensured in any given society, we must point to the finger to acknowledge that when a woman, girls, and those most vulnerable in any society are not taken care of, our own well-being is also fundamentally can be impacted. So what we do at Women for Men to address some of those pervasive issues of our women's rights is we do two things. We work directly with women to help them realize and harness their own potential power. Because for all intended purposes, until individuals in a given society can stand up and champion their own rights, and the rights for women often start at the family level. At the family level is often, when you talk about these whole issues around state rebuilding, very often family law is the big issue. We say less weight on all those issues that are important, and we'll negotiate at the end. And very often what is negotiated are family law and women's rights. Whether it's women's rights access to education, whether it's women's rights access to movement, whether it's women's rights access to agriculture education. And we know too often the data, thankfully, with the likes of Goldman Sachs and the likes of the World Banks, we know fundamentally when we invest $1 in a woman, something like 90 cents goes back to the family. Now we know for peace building, we know for recovery that fundamentally if we are to address poverty, if we are to address peace, we must necessarily invest in women. But yet over and over again, we continuously are making the same mistakes. So we need to ask ourselves, why is that? What's important to us? If poverty is important to us, if addressing poverty is important to us, without a doubt, we need to invest in women. If addressing peace and stability, we need to address in women. If addressing violence against women, we need to address it on women. Now, as I say this, I must acknowledge to tell you, on the issue of violence against women, it is not an issue alone that women alone should be looking at. We cannot address violence against women in the context of war and conflict or in any environment by simply looking at the victims or the survivors, I would like to call them. Because the victims and survivors are not the cause of the conflict, of the violence. And so we must look at men, the role of men. And it's an issue we haven't actually taken enough time globally for those of us who are concerned about this issue. The fundamental role of men in addressing issues of violence against women is critical. We cannot begin to talk about accountability if we have not yet talked about responsibility. And the responsibility for the well-being of women in the issue around violence against women is something that is fundamentally rests with men, whether we're talking about husbands, fathers, brothers, and the leadership itself. Men must be the one to champion the cause. One of the side of the women's rights issues that we are so critically needed, and for the men in this room, my call to you is to start leading a men's liberation in your own community. As you talk about these issues of human rights violation, I want you to consider in every single one of the communities, when you're faced with those issues, the issue of women's right, what's your position on it? Because we so desperately need men to begin to articulate and champion these issues. Because without men, side by side, with each other, addressing these issues, we will not go very far. So my call out to the men in this room who've been talking about the past 2 days about human rights violation is to please, when you go back to your community, to begin to look at those issues in the context at the household level, in your community, in your home, how women are protected or not protected, and what is it that you will be accountable to do to ensure that moving forward, we cannot continue at the pace that we have been going when it comes to violation of women's rights. The reason is not because, it's good for women, that it is. The reason is because no society will function in progress if the very wealth of women's knowledge, women's expertise, women's work is not protected. From child's education to protecting the family, if we don't begin to actually take those issues as fundamental part of our struggle, we will be limited in our ability to actually make progress in any context, in any society. So as I close my talk in terms of what we need to do and how we need to move forward, I want to put out a call to the men in the room to go back, whether it's to invest in terms of your contribution, but your time, your expertise, and speaking up against violation of women's rights in your community. So my call out to you and all of the men in the room is to do that. For the women in the room is to actually encourage them to do that, because I think for too long, the discussion around women's rights has been purely at the center stage, only women talking about women's rights. But we need to begin to look at the issues as in issues that concern society as a whole, which means half of the population who are affected, women, must step to the plate. But fundamentally, the other half of the population, men, who are responsible and very often accountable, must move from perpetrators to protectors. So with that, I thank you.